Imagine you're teaching a client to request a break, but they only do it when you're holding a timer, not when they're actually overwhelmed. That's the difference between stimulus control and motivating operations, and it's a distinction that will appear repeatedly on your BCBA exam. In this session, we'll break down the core differences between MOs and SDs, compare them side by side, and explore the 3 types of motivating operations and 4 types of condition motivating operations. You'll also see how they function differently in a functional analysis and, most importantly, how they work together in real-world practice. Understanding this isn't just about passing the test. It's about designing interventions that actually change behavior. Let's get clear on what drives responding and what merely sets the occasion for it. On the BCBA exam, you must distinguish between motivating operations and discriminative stimuli, as both are antecedents but function differently. A motivating operation alters the effectiveness of a reinforcer or punisher and changes the current frequency of behavior. For example, food deprivation makes food more valuable, increasing behaviors that previously led to food. In contrast, a discriminative stimulus signals that a specific response will be reinforced in its presence and not in its absence, like a green light indicating that pressing the gas pedal will move the car forward. The core distinction lies in mechanism. An MO changes the value of a reinforcer itself, making it more or less potent at that moment, while an SD signals the availability of that reinforcer for a particular behavior right now. Both occur before behavior and influence its likelihood, but the MO alters motivation and the SD signals opportunity. Exam questions often ask you to identify which antecedent is at play based on whether value or availability is being changed. Let's break down the critical distinction between motivating operations and stimulus control, because the BCBA exam will test your ability to tell them apart. An MO alters the value of a reinforcer or punisher. For example, food deprivation makes food more valuable, increasing the frequency of all behaviors that have previously produced food. In contrast, an SD signals that a specific response will produce that reinforcer, like a bell indicating that pressing a lever will deliver food. The MO changes behavior broadly by affecting the effectiveness of consequences, while the SD evokes a precise behavior due to past reinforcement in its presence. Crucially, they can operate independently. You could be hungry, MO, with no food in sight, no SD, or see food, SD, but not be hungry, no MO. On the exam, expect scenario-based questions asking you to identify whether a change in behavior is due to an altered reinforcer value or a discriminative signal. Mastering this distinction is essential for designing effective interventions. Now, let's break down the 3 types of motivating operations you need to know for the BCBA exam. First, unconditioned motivating operations, or UMOs, are innate. Things like food deprivation or sleep deprivation alter the value of unconditioned reinforcers without any learning history. They're tied directly to biological survival. Then we have conditioned motivating operations, or CMOs, which acquire their value through learning. For example, token deprivation only works because the tokens have been paired with backup reinforcers in the past. Finally, there's the surrogate CMO, or CMOS, which is a stimulus that gains its effect by being paired with a UMO, like a specific location that triggers food-seeking behavior because it was consistently associated with food deprivation. On the exam, you'll need to distinguish these from stimulus control. Motivating operations alter the momentary value of a reinforcer, while stimulus control involves a stimulus that signals the availability of a reinforcer and evokes a specific behavior. Understanding this difference is critical for designing effective interventions. This slide breaks down the 4 types of conditioned motivating operations, each of which temporarily alters a reinforcer's value and evokes behavior. A key distinction from stimulus control, which involves a discriminative stimulus signaling reinforcement availability. First, CMOS, surrogate, gains its motivational function through pairing with another MO, like a neutral sound becoming an EO after being paired with food deprivation. Next, CMOR, reflexive, is correlated with a worsening or improving condition. For example, a warning stimulus that signals an impending aversive event makes escape more valuable. Finally, CMOT, transitive, alters the value of another stimulus as a reinforcer. The classic locked door example makes the key more valuable, evoking key-seeking behavior. On the BCBA exam, you must recognize that CMOs change the momentary effectiveness of consequences, whereas stimulus control involves antecedent stimuli that evoke behavior due to a history of differential reinforcement. Understanding this distinction is critical for designing effective interventions. Let's clarify a critical distinction for the BCBA exam: the difference between motivating operations and stimulus control. While an MO alters the value of a reinforcer, like how withholding attention makes it more valuable, evoking any behavior that has previously earned attention, a discriminative stimulus does not change reinforcer value. It only signals that a specific behavior will be reinforced right now. Notice the functional difference. An MO has an evocative effect on a whole class of behaviors tied to that reinforcer, and it can also have an abolishing effect through satiation, reducing the reinforcer's power. In contrast, an SD evokes only the particular behavior reinforced in its presence and never alters the reinforcer's effectiveness. On the exam, you might see a scenario where a client requests more when ignored. That's an MO at work. But if a therapist says, "What do you want?" and the client requests, that's stimulus control. Understanding these separate mechanisms, deprivation versus past reinforcement history, is essential for designing effective interventions. On this slide, we see how motivating operations and stimulus control work together in practice, a key concept for the BCBA exam. The process begins with an MO, such as food deprivation, which establishes the value of food as a powerful reinforcer, thereby increasing the individual's motivation to obtain it. Next, a discriminative stimulus, like a food bowl, signals that a specific response, pressing a lever, will now produce that reinforcer. When a strong MO is combined with a clear SD, the target behavior occurs with high probability because the value and the opportunity align. Finally, delivering the reinforcer strengthens that behavior, making it more likely to occur under similar conditions in the future. For the exam, remember that MOs alter the effectiveness of consequences and evoke behavior, while SDs signal the availability of those consequences. Understanding this interaction helps you analyze why a behavior occurs in a given context, a critical skill for designing effective interventions. Now, let's examine key exam scenarios that clarify the difference between motivating operations and stimulus control. Deprivation, like a child who hasn't had a tablet all day, increases the value of the tablet as a reinforcer. This is an MO. Satiation, such as after a large meal, decreases food's effectiveness, also an MO. In contrast, an SD, like a green light on a vending machine, signals that a specific response will produce reinforcement. The critical distinction appears when they combine. A hungry person, MO, sees a restaurant sign, SD, and enters to eat. Both are present. However, an MO without an SD, like extreme thirst with no water available, means no behavior occurs because the discriminative stimulus is absent. Conversely, an SD without an MO, like a soda machine present but no thirst, also yields no response. For the BCBA exam, you must identify whether a variable alters the value of a reinforcer, MO, or signals the availability of that reinforcer, SD. Practice distinguishing these in applied scenarios. This slide breaks down 3 types of discriminative stimuli that are essential for understanding how antecedents control behavior, a core concept you will see tested on the BCBA exam. A simple SD is straightforward. A single stimulus, like a red light, signals that a specific response will be reinforced. This is the foundation of early discrimination training and is easy to establish experimentally. A conditional SD is more complex because the discriminative function of one stimulus depends on the presence of another. For example, a red circle signals reinforcement only when paired with a specific context, not a blue square. This type of stimulus control is critical in matching to sample procedures and reflects the nuanced discriminations clients must learn in natural settings. Finally, the S delta is a stimulus in the presence of which a response will not be reinforced, such as a red light, signaling no food for a lever press. S deltas sharpen discrimination by reducing the likelihood of behavior in their presence. On the exam, expect questions that ask you to identify which type of SD is operating in a given scenario or to explain how these stimuli work together to establish appropriate stimulus control. Let's take a moment to understand how the BCBA exam distributes its questions across the domains, because this directly shapes your study priorities. On this slide, you see the breakdown of questions by content area, which tells you exactly where to focus your preparation. For example, The domain covering behavior change procedures and interventions typically carries the highest number of questions, often around 30 to 35% of the exam. That means you need to be especially strong in selecting, implementing, and evaluating interventions based on functional assessment data. In contrast, domains like philosophical underpinnings or measurement may have fewer questions, but they still require mastery because every point counts toward your passing score. As you study, use this distribution to allocate your time wisely. Spend more effort on high-weight areas like ethics and behavior assessment, but don't neglect lower-weight domains entirely. Knowing this breakdown helps you approach the exam strategically, ensuring you're prepared for the types and proportions of questions you'll actually see. On this slide, we're sharpening the distinction between motivating operations and stimulus control, a high-yield topic for the BCBA exam. The goal of an MO is to alter the value of a reinforcer, while an SD signals when a specific response will pay off. For example, withholding access to a preferred item increases its value as a reinforcer. That's an MO, whereas presenting a picture card to prompt a request for that item is an SD. Notice the effect on behavior. An MO broadly affects all behaviors maintained by that reinforcer, while an SD specifically evokes the target behavior in its presence. Implementation strategies differ too. Manipulate deprivation or satiation for MOs, and arrange clear environmental cues for SDs. The task list item G.5 explicitly requires you to incorporate both MOs and SDs into behavior change procedures. On the exam, you'll need to identify which is being used based on whether the intervention changes reinforcer value or signals a contingency. One of the most common pitfalls on the BCBA exam is confusing motivating operations with stimulus control. So let's break down these 6 frequent mistakes. First, never assume an SD changes the value of a reinforcer. It only signals that reinforcement is available. MOs are the ones that alter value, making a reinforcer more or less effective. Second, always consider context. The same stimulus, like a teacher's presence, could be an MO in one setting, evoking escape from a difficult task, and an SD in another, signaling praise for correct answers. Third, don't overlook satiation. This is an MO that decreases reinforcer value. So even with a clear SD present, behavior may drop if the reinforcer is no longer potent. Fourth, behavior does not always require both an MO and an SD. Either can operate alone, though they often work together. Fifth, not every antecedent is an MO. Only those that alter reinforcer value qualify. Others are SDs or S-deltas. Finally, remember the 3 CMO types, CMOS, CMOR, and CMOD each have distinct functions and are tested separately, so study their unique effects on behavior. On this slide, we're comparing motivating operations and stimulus control at a mastery level, meaning you need to know not just definitions, but how these concepts interact on the exam. A motivating operation, MO, alters the value of a reinforcer and changes the current frequency of behavior that has produced that reinforcer. Stimulus control, via a discriminative stimulus, SD, signals the availability of that reinforcer. The key distinction: an MO makes a reinforcer more or less valuable, while an SD signals that a specific response will produce that reinforcer. For the BCBA exam, you'll see scenarios where an MO establishes the value of a reinforcer, and then an SD evokes the behavior. For example, food deprivation, an MO, makes food valuable, and the sight of a vending machine, an SD, signals that inserting money will produce food. Understanding this interplay is critical for designing effective interventions. Manipulating MOs can increase motivation, while SDs can cue appropriate responses. Expect multiple choice questions asking you to identify whether a variable is an MO or an SD based on its function. As we close, remember that mastering the distinction between motivating operations and stimulus control is not just about memorizing definitions. It's about understanding how behavior is momentarily driven versus reliably evoked. On the BCBA exam, the core takeaway is that an MO alters the value of a reinforcer and the current frequency of behavior, while an SD signals that a specific response will produce that reinforcer. You've explored how UMOs, CMOs, and their subtypes shape motivation, and how SS, S-deltas, and SS guide discrimination. The real exam edge comes from recognizing that MOs and SDs work together. An MO creates the need, and an SD points to the opportunity. Avoid common pitfalls like confusing an establishing operation with a simple cue or misidentifying CMOT versus CMOR. With this foundation, you're ready to tackle any scenario, from verbal behavior to practical interventions. Now, take that confidence into your next study session and turn this knowledge into exam day success. You got this.